Welcome one and all as we celebrate the publication of CLASP with the co-editors, and it's terrific that there are so many of the contributors to the magazine here this evening. I thought that I would be in conversation with both Robert and Ken, and indeed we will do that, but actually I know that this is going to be a much wider conversation, and I know there are plenty of people there who will want to ask questions, express opinions about this act of collective memory, which I think is a wonderful description of what this is. As Susie said, it was slightly before my time in London, so it has been a particular education in many ways for me, and it has been such a pleasure to read these contributions on a number of fronts, not least the sheer energy of what was going on, and also I think bits of it are very, very funny. I laughed out loud on occasions, which is in a good way, of course. But there is just that sense of energy that was around. And I think also, on reflection, having been in London now for quite some time and having been involved in literature for quite some time, how many of the old arguments have come full circle and repeat and repeat and repeat. And I'm sure at some point tonight we'll talk about the Poetry Society, and we'll talk about maybe in passing the Arts Council and all of that. But I really hope that you will feel free to correct. There are errors of memory, to interpret, as I'm sure you'll want to, and maybe, come on, it's a poetry event, settle a few old scores. Isn't that what happens? So I thought I'd begin with Ken and Robert, and maybe Robert, just to ask you about the political context in which all this was happening, because it seems to me that's central.
Yeah. Well, I was going to start with late 60s and with the Labour government under Harold Wilson, being followed in 1970 by Ted Heath, and then very interesting times with the first miners' strike, the 4-day week, and all kinds of things like that going on. The big thing in the background was the Vietnam War and the kind of protests about the Vietnam War as one part of the context for the kind of immediate political context for this, or where these things started from.
Yeah. And Ken, the international influences that were apparent for modernist poets, and particularly the American influence, that is writ large throughout the book.
I grew up reading some poetry, but very little contemporary poetry that really interested me. And one of the major influences on me when I was an undergraduate at almost the same time as Robert at King's was Eric Mottram, Professor Eric Mottram, the late Eric Mottram, who talked extensively and very engagingly and interestingly about contemporary writing, and particularly poetry, and particularly a lot of contemporary American poets who I hadn't heard of. And I knew some of them. I knew Ginsberg and people like that, but Olson and projected verse, and then his influence on certain British poets such as Roy Fisher and Tom Raworth, and influence of American culture generally on poets who were writing at the time. It was all new to me, and I also didn't know about small presses until quite late on. So at first it was difficult to find these texts, and then I realised there was a whole small press world that was burgeoning and was bringing out a lot of stuff that didn't hit the mainstream.
Right.
So that was all very exciting and interesting for me at the time.
Yeah, and that's something I want to come back to, the whole small press world, and actually the communication of all this. But on that international front, Robert. Yeah.
Well, when Ken and I first met, Pound was still alive. Olson was still alive, they were still publishing work. When the early period of the Poetry Society, the people on the committee involved Hugh MacDiarmid, Basil Bunting, David Jones was still alive. So it was that sense that the modernist tradition hadn't actually happened in 1921 and then died. But actually these people were still writing and still functioning at that time. was another part of this. Ken mentioned Roy Fisher, and Roy Fisher, I think, was a very important figure for me, and again was someone through whom I then discovered more about migrant press and the kind of interactions between migrant press and the interactions they set up between British and American poetry.
Right.
And that sense of Roy Fisher as producing a modernism which worked in a British context, even in a British provincial context.
Yeah,
was
yeah.
very important.
Many of those American poets came through London and through England. Yeah. Did the traffic go the other way?
It did, yeah. I'm trying to think. Can you think?
Not so much, though. Really, not so much. I mean, one of the sad things for me is that we knew much more about them than they knew about us.
Right.
And I think I actually think that was regrettable. But both Robert and I did forge relationships and contacts with a lot of contemporary American poets, and it was lively. But the nature of things is that we the stuff that was happening here that we valued was probably not known very much across the pond. Right. And that continues to be the case, I think.
Yeah. Although there was a great welcome in America for poets from here, just on a sheer hospitality level.
Oh, yeah.
There are pieces in there where people go with letters of introduction.
Yes, that's right.
And they're treated
absolutely.
Yes.
That's what I found personally as well. That you went over there and you were treated really, really well, really generously, and really, that was certainly the case.
Yeah.
Some of the poets who were known there would be Tom Rayworth, Alan Fisher, Lee Howard spent time in New York. So there was a certain amount of it.
And then there were a couple of seminal events here. I'm thinking about the Poetry Olympics, the International Festival, all of that. They seem to act as a real focal point for all of this.
And the big Albert Hall event.
And the Albert Hall, of course, which was organised at very short notice.
Yeah, about 24 hours, 48 hours.
And brought 4,000 people?
Thousands, I don't know.
Okay. Give or take.
Give or take, yeah.
I was astonished how people knew about these things. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have anything like that.
Absolutely.
Suddenly 4,000 people turn up.
Yeah.
How?
Exactly. I mean, we killed for that. For that knowledge. And that is a very interesting point, actually, because when you read this, what really got to me most was the amount of activity. You think of poetry readings in London, and often you do think of central London now, but at this time they were happening everywhere. Croydon, the Crown and Greyhound of West Dulwich, Jock Farm, all over the place. And I just wondered how communication worked. How did people know? How were audiences attracted to these? Were audiences attracted to them? Or was it very much an internal poets reading to poets?
It varied from location to location. Some of it was to do with bookshops, independent bookshops. You mentioned Turret Books much earlier when we were talking. So things like Turret Books, Compendium Books, Better Books were also hubs for information. You'd find out things that were going on there either through posters or through meeting people.
Yeah, of course. And the Poetry Society looms large in all of this. Would you say something about that? The relationship seems to have blown hot and cold depending on who was on the committee. And this was the famous days of Earl's Court before they moved to Covent Garden.
Our experience is probably similar. We joined sometime in the very early 70s. And this was this was the point when the committee was very much Bob Cobb. Eric Mottram was editing the journal. It was Bob Cobbing, it was Lee Howard, it was Barry McSweeney, it was... No, he's not here, is he? Sorry, but Lawrence Upton and others had been elected onto the committee, so a lot of us then joined the society. And for a number of years, 71 through to about 76, 77, it was very active, all kinds of things going on there, lots of visitors from the States, a couple of sound poetry festivals I remember going to. There was a weekly or monthly Thursday night poetry information event where there's someone, I remember Lee Howard talking about surrealist poetry, and Bill Griffiths I think talking about Old English lyrics and so on. But it was a bit like the Labour Party in the summer that we voted for the wrong committee. So that we were told we voted for the wrong person. This was made clear to us, and that there was an effort made to guide us and to choose the right people rather than the wrong people.
Right.
At which point it became impossible for me to stay on longer, since the votes made by the members were being overruled.
Right.
Centrally.
Okay. We'll come to that.
We'll come back to that. I don't know whether your memory is...
Yeah, okay, what's...
I wasn't centrally involved in the Poetry Society. I was a kind of a fringe participant, and by the time I got more into organising stuff, it had all blown up, and people had moved on. So I have to say we have slightly avoided this topic in this book, because it's dealt with actually very interestingly in Peter Barry's book, what's it? I can't remember the name. Poetry Books, yeah. And that is I think a pretty fair account of what happened.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then the relationship with the Arts Council, because whether we like it or not, that's always a crucial connection in the arts world, and certainly in the poetry world. And there are a couple of glancing references there, particularly to Charles Osborne, who was the director of literature at the time. So what was that like? What was that relationship like?
Not good.
Politely put.
My involvement, like Ken's, was kind of peripheral. We were watching things from the side. We weren't on the committee. That other people in the room might have been on the committee. So we didn't actually see what the discussions taking place. We saw the ripples that came from the discussions, and the sense we had was that they were coming under pressure. Yeah. And there were then splits about how to respond to that pressure. Right. And those splits were very wounding. People made different decisions. And that then had an effect for a long time afterwards for those particular individuals involved on the committee, whichever way they'd gone on those votes. Right. But we were just we were further out. We weren't really. We just felt the ripple rather than being involved.
And was it as clear cut as establishment versus anti-establishment? Was it that?
Felt that way from where we were. But
of course. Yeah. Of course. And just think there were so many different kinds of poetry being written at that time, and indeed a great mix of the arts. I mean, I think you refer to the fluidity of attention, so it really was cross art form in that way. But what was audience response like? What was it difficult to generate audiences? What did that feel like? I mean, both readers and audiences for the live events and publications.
I was going to come at it from another route, and give me time to think. Because when you were talking about the kind of energy, one of the important figures there is Bob Copping, Stevens, who wrote a PhD on this, about the way in which Bob Copping was involved in organising. And was you know this better than I do, but that it was involved with the film co-op, the musicians co-op, a whole range of these bodies that he was involved with. So there's an awful lot of energy that being from him and from his organisation. Audience, I think, would vary a lot depending on who was reading, who was performing, what the venue was. I can certainly remember events at the Poetry Society where the reading was full. But again, depending on who the performer.
Of course. I mean, was it the case that, as always been the case, more writers than readers?
It's been generally the case in poetry that the readership that doesn't write poetry is pretty minuscule. But I think there was a genuine sense of excitement and spark. You know, it was and also talked about fluidity between art forms. I think that was something that was relatively new at the time, and was for me very interesting. And it was a time when you would there were things happening which had a high profile, which were genuinely new and interesting, and it seemed to me that marketisation of the arts has rather dimmed that in the years that have gone by. I had the sense of boundaries being crossed and the boundaries between music and poetry and performance and poetry and exciting things being done in film and all kind of interfering with each other and in creative ways. And so that's what I recall of the period. And it's certainly the case that I think things have got a lot more homogenised in recent years, and it's very different now from what it was then. Whether it's overall better or worse, I can't say, but I was certainly energised by stuff that was happening that was outside of poetry.
I mean, it certainly feels less energetic now. When I read this and see that there was a real sense of energy, and I don't get that at the moment. Now that may be to do with politics. There was, in many ways, a lot more going on then, nationally and internationally, to get to grips with. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I was thinking also that there was all the work done by Horowitz in the 60s as well. That the rise of the poetry reading in the 60s, with people like Pete Brown and Michael Horowitz going around, and there were big audiences for that. So there was a large popular audience, which is also where the Albert Hall event fits into all that. It probably was a different audience at the Albert Hall from those attending these other events. Or Morden Tower, that I mentioned earlier. Again, you were getting, it looked like quite sizable audiences there, as a popular audience for poetry in the 60s, which isn't really the case now. But also there were a couple of other organisations I was thinking about. There was we don't mention very much, if at all, the Association of Little Presses, which was set up in the 70s, which brought together the various little presses and had this annual fair, really, a book fair. And there's something, it's a bit like the event that takes place now at Red Lion Square every year. But that was a kind of regular event where, again, you met people, you communicated with people, the information was passed on. I was also thinking about the GLA, the Great GLAA, the Great London Arts Association, which had some funding. And I think we got some funding from the one point. £25 or.
Well, they had a scheme which was expressly intended for funding poetry readings, and astonishing to think of now. What was it called? The London Poetry Secretariat.
Exactly.
That's right.
LPS.
And if you could show you were a bona fide poetry reading organiser, and you could say that you were charging at the door and people had access to it, you could have a grant to pay the poets. And I remember another initiative of Bob Cobbing's and others was Poets Conference.
That's
right.
That's right. Which is basically a trade union for poets.
With a minimum wage.
With a minimum wage. And I remember they used to specify a minimum £30 as a reading fee plus expenses. This is in early 70s. Don't know what that would be worth now. And you got it. I mean, the funds were there and people were paid.
And we were still trying to do that in my time.
Were they still?
Trying to get venues to commit to a proper fee for poets who read.
And that seems to have gone by the board somewhat. I mean, there are still thriving poetry reading series in London, but they run on a shoestring. It's just you get paid what's paid up at the door, and that's it.
And
I
mean, I'm just thinking in there as well. There was the Writers on Tour program. There's a wonderful story. I won't remember the names. I know Alan Bennett was on it, but the poet who was on it felt absolutely out of place. Couldn't quite understand, and they were bemused by the poet, and he just thought, what is going on here?
It's Anthony Howell, I think.
Anthony Howell, you're right, absolutely. And the book is full of great stories like that. I don't want to talk now about legacy. I want to come back to that. But I think this might be a good moment just to open things out and ask. And Stephen, you mentioned PhD and Bob Cobbing. Would you like to say just a little bit about that?
Sure, I'll give it a go. No, it's just wonderful hearing Robert and Ken talk about the time, and I guess I just like to press you a little bit more on the idea of being on the periphery. Really, I mean, to be in this centre, I guess, means being on the council, the Arts Council, or the committee for the Poetry Society. Sorry, but what does being on the periphery kind of mean? Does that mean you didn't attend events that often, or you heard what was going on second hand, or you didn't feel kind of so personally attacked?
It's the middle of those,
okay.
In my case. It was a sense of there were decisions being made, things were happening that the committee knew about, and these were kind of relayed to us, or to me, so that it was hearing things at second hand, not knowing things at first hand. It didn't mean I didn't feel attacked, but it was hearing at second hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in my case, it's just I wasn't part of the structure then. I wasn't part of the committee. I wasn't centrally involved, but I was certainly well informed about what was going on and was friendly with a lot of people who were.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And interesting as well that it comes up a few times in the book that for all the politics and all of that was going on, one of the things missing was feminism.
Yeah.
And a number of the women writers kind of draw attention quite rightly to that. So it was a sense of a very male-oriented scene. Not entirely, of course, clearly, but feminism was not a big deal in that environment.
Not in that environment. It was around in other parts. So there would be encounters.
It's worth inserting an episode, an anecdote. Eric once told me one of the anthologies which he edited of poetry had within it a separate section for women poets. And a very prominent woman poet at the time, whom he did not name to me, he asked if she would like to be in this section, and her answer was, "Hell no, I want to play with the A team."
Okay. Which is the same argument that you hear now about the prize that used to be the Orange Prize, the Women's Prize for Fiction. There are writers.
I mean, it's an argument you heard from women. It was an argument I might well have supported at one time.
Yeah.
And it was only, I think so well said feminism is when you start to care about it.
Right.
And you can be aware of all these issues, but actually, and when I was first introduced to feminism, which was in the early 70s in America, by this very kind of fiery Italian woman academic, and I thought, well, this is a bit reductive, isn't it? And I sort of did it what she wanted, because you get A grades that way, and I read my Simone de Beauvoir, but it was actually only when I started work that I thought, actually this means something in the real world, in terms of power and money and status. And I wrote about it in my contribution, but it was quite intimidating. I mean, I found Bob Cobbing quite intimidating, to be honest.
Did you?
And I didn't think he was that interested in women either. Although obviously other women have had other experiences, but at the time it certainly felt like there was a kind of male group.
I wondered about that because it seemed that Bob was very welcoming to a lot of people, so I'm interested to hear your perspective on that.
I suppose particularly going to the subversive readings, Jackson's Lane, it was always this group of male performers. It would be Clive, Gilbert, Bob. And just as a presence, I mean, he was huge and frightening, quite.
Well, it was frightening to a lot of people, not just...
No, exactly. No, I realise that.
That was one of the criticisms that could be levelled against the scene, was that it was, without intending to be, it was exclusionary. I've had many accounts of people who've kind of been new to London, wanting to know what's interesting in poetry and wandering into some voice-it or whatever, and feeling this is a club to which I'm not invited. And some people stuck it out and then, were accepted. But I imagined it was intimidating to a lot of people, and probably particularly a lot of women.
But you got the impression that some male poets were quite collaborative
Right.
with women. I mean, I mentioned what's up to here.
Yeah.
To be honest, to be fair to Bob Codding was, quite happy to encourage. I mean, he collaborated with Paula Clare, for instance, and ostensibly quite happy to encourage women. But
obviously, I remember Paula Clare, but she wasn't in London.
No.
Yeah. And none of the women actually came together.
No.
There was no sense of a group or connection. So in that sense, it was quite, you felt on the periphery talking.
Yeah.
On the periphery, and it was always a central male group.
Right.
Pretty much.
Right.
I mean, there were women who came in and went. But
Okay.
Could I just jump in here? I think one of the things I mentioned in my memoir is the way that shifted somewhat in the context of the London Musicians Collective, LMC. I remember a far stronger female presence there. Paula Clare, who's already been mentioned, obviously, Patricia Farrell in particular, and a fair number of women, I think, but maybe also drawn by the music context, the poetry, music, and art, in fact, visual art.
Right.
Yeah. So I think as you move into the 80s, you get, wouldn't you agree, Francis, an improvement in that situation?
Not
More
for a long
accessible.
time. I mean, I didn't really feel that feminist poetry took off really until the 90s. I mean, some young woman said to me, I think the 90s was awful. I thought the 90s was quite good. For feminism, certainly, for women's poetry, there was suddenly a new upsurge in interest. And there was that whole argument by some women poets about not wanting to be identified as feminists, particularly in the experimental scene, because they saw it as representing something mainstream and conventional, which obviously a lot of feminist poetry had been fairly conventional, although not all. And that's it was a bit of a.
I recall that it was late 80s. I started having lots of conversations with Wendy Mulford, who was quite unhappy about the same sort of issues in Cambridge at that time, and we all know, talking about that with Tony about that anthology of various art, which had this impenetrable introduction where you had no idea why these overwhelmingly male poets had been brought together with one dead woman, Veronica Forrest Thompson, and it was astonishing that neither Wendy nor Denise Riley were in that anthology.
Right.
And so I was having a lot of conversations with Wendy around those issues, because she was running a small press. She was running Street Editions, which was publishing Veronica Forrest Thompson, first publisher of Denise Riley, also publishing Tom Rayworth and J.H. Prynne and her then husband John James, and so we started talking about this issue of what women's place in avant-garde poetry, and I don't think that led eventually to Reality Street or Reality Street Editions, which Wendy and I co-founded. I don't think she's been given enough credit for what she did to counter those male-centered tendencies.
Yeah. I mean, the problem was that there wasn't a network.
Yeah.
We weren't all talking together.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Right.
right. And there was the separate Cambridge scene and the London scene. And that was another issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Robert.
I was just going to say, I think there's also a difference between feminism and presence of women, in that there was no awareness of feminism around in some parts of the scene from early 70s, but there weren't that many women taking part in this scene for various reasons.
Because they didn't feel all that included.
Yeah.
Whereas in the mainstream, it was much more expansive and genial.
But it was also the case in the early 70s that I knew women who wrote poetry but didn't join any part of the poetry world. They were involved with feminist groups.
Yeah.
So they decided to put their energy not into poetry at all, although they wrote poetry.
Yeah.
And they subsequently stopped writing poetry, but they got involved with various feminist groups instead. That's what they saw. That was their priority in the 70s.
Right. Yes.
We started off talking about Eric Mottram.
Yeah.
It's worth, I think, mentioning the obvious fact that we're talking about a pre-digital, pre-computer age. And Eric was, in a very real sense, a one-man internet.
Yeah.
He traveled all over America and England. He brought the good news from Ghent to Aix over and over and over again, from here to there to there. And he was passionate about communication. And I did my MA with him in 1949, 1951, prehistory. And the subject of his seminars was the American imagination of synthesis. Computers are the imagination of synthesis in a very real sense, and he was there first. And as everybody knows, he was a vast collector of tapes and of videos and of everything, audio visual way. And he had the prescience, he dared to allow me to record every lecture and every seminar that he gave on this two-year period, and as probably most of you know, it's all up on a website. It's all been digitized somewhere around 200 hours worth. But he, as in so many ways, he was there before us.
Yeah, yeah. Terrific. Yeah, and often that is the case. It's one kind of huge presence that generates all this activity, but the recording of it is such a hugely valuable resource apart from anything else.
But then the combination of Eric and Nuttall, whom we've not mentioned, and Cobbing.
Yeah.
There was then three very energetic.
And Michael Horowitz.
And there's limitations obviously as a result of that, but
it was Eric who put me together. It was Eric who put me together with Bob Cobbing and Clive Fencott to form that group which we called Oral Complex, and of sound and treatment. And I had rather elaborate equipment I was using with musical groups, and putting it at the service of sound poetry produced some very interesting things. I'm in the process of setting up another website with that stuff on it. My purpose and end of my life is the preservation of my betters.
Yes, I'd like to pick up on 2 points mentioned earlier. Am I remembering this right, Robert, that you made a distinction between feminism and female participation and enterprise? Or something like that, yes. Connecting that for a moment with the anthology that's been mentioned, The New British Poetry, which Ken was one of the 4 co-editors of, were you not? There was, one of the 4 sections was indeed poetry by women. It stood out very much that those women were not, on the whole, experimental practitioners. So, as well as a gender contrast, there was a strong contrast of approach to poetry. And it would be interesting to hear from Francis about how things have developed since then in terms of experimental women poets, becoming more visible.
Well, I kind of touched on that. I mean, at the time I thought it was this kind of false dichotomy, and obviously there was this, kind of strange, well, not strange, it's actually not surprising, sort of opposition to feminism amongst experimental poets, as opposed to the more traditional poets, being the feminists. And I kind of moved between both groups, and I was unhappy with both, really, because I was bored with what most of the mainstream feminist poets were doing, and at the same time, the poets I was excited by were not, advocates of feminism. They hadn't got the point. They'd kind of misunderstanding. As someone who'd sort of seen the light in 1980, and so, as I said initially, I was more at home with feminist art, but then I think that all changed by the 90s, and certainly experimental women poets feminism was very strong, increasingly so, and has continued to be.
Well, Catherine Fraser talked about the same problem in New York. Much earlier, 10 years earlier.
But just thinking about those issues like feminism or whatever, and the traffic America to the UK, was there traffic anywhere else? Or was it simply the English language dominated? There wasn't much interest in translation.
Well, one big exception would be Paul Buck. Paul Buck's And what Curtins did was bring in a lot of French theory and French writing. It was really very far ahead of its time. And Lee Holland's translations as well.
And Paul Brown was translating Belgian and Flemish writers, and there was a few.
So there was a bit,
there was a bit,
but it wasn't very broadly spread.
No.
The other thing was that was.
Sorry, Steve.
It should be said it was only a bit.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, that's the sense. Certainly.
I think there were. Certainly I was writing about Darwin surrealism, and
surrealism aren't the only.
No, they're not. They're not.
Or international.
No, they're not. There's Apollinaire too, but I think it was an important part of what we were doing.
More than Apollinaire, I'm sorry, really.
Yes, there are.
I'm a wee bit
lots
of
of
an
others.
outsider here,
Lots of others. No.
Were you more involved with translation at that time, or was that later?
Yeah, I just. Bill Griffiths was interested in, went to Hungary and was interested in Hungarian poetry. I remember a big reading of some wonderful Hungarian poets at King's in the probably late 70s, early 80s. But it's more this sort of sense, and forgive me if I'm saying a few things and then I'll have to dash off. Strangely enough to King's, where a lot of the roots of all the discussion might have been. But I do feel a sense of sort of many parallel worlds that didn't necessarily overlap, and that to do with translation, that to do with worker writers, that to do with poets living in this country not writing in English, who I don't mean any of this pejoratively actually, this is a very wide thing, and this is a wonderful collection of essays, but just looking back, I'm sort of feeling, why wasn't there more interaction? I'm looking at myself and sort of saying to myself, why wasn't I more involved with, say, with Will Rowe at the time, who I knew and respected and everything else, but I wasn't really interacting. And so I'm saying,
and what do you think
why
the
didn't
answer?
those things?
Why do you think that was?
I have no idea really. It's maybe, I really don't know.
Was it to do with some exclusivity on one side, or?
No, I don't. I think it was more that to both to survive and to create things with a certain intensity, there had to be that concentration, and it's a rare person or a rare organisation that can actually concentrate and be completely open at the same time. I don't know.
One thing that strikes me about the international aspect of the Poetry Society is that when there was international collaboration, Bob was very close to the French, Austrian sound poets and to Filpinken in Sweden, which then he brought those sound festivals, which were originally based in Europe, to London. But I guess that version of translation where a common language is found through sound or found through technological manipulation of machines, is quite different from the kinds of translation efforts that you were involved in. And groups which maybe do need kind of a deep attention to the actual meaning of language.
But both are essential for what we're considering, really. And so, I mean, I'd love to be involved in.
I think they're both essential, but I wonder at the time whether there was just a different kind of ethos around internationalism. I guess it's my speculation.
I suppose I'm remembering, going to readings with quite big audiences when Adonis or Mahmoud Darwish came over, and they were coming over maybe not quite in the 70s, but certainly in the early 80s. And I think the audiences for that, well, yes, they would have been predominantly Arabic speaking, but I'm not sure how many poets, whether from the mainstream or from that wide range of experimental writing, were drawn into that. And I suppose I sort of regret that it didn't manage to happen, because then the wonderful energies that were present in the 70s might have, well, of course they did create many things later, but it might have grown into a more...
I'm not sure about internationalism and attitudes towards that. My sense was it's not there wasn't international concern, but also it was more difficult then. Like, it was more difficult to go to France. That you, as we might need in the future, you'd need to make sure you had a visa to go to these places. So the travel just wasn't as easy as it has been in recent years.
But we were also colonised by America.
That's
why we were so obsessed with American poetry. And I went to America, I lived there for a year, and I realised I was European for the first time in my life. And I thought, I must get back to Europe, I must start studying more European poetry, which is how I ended up doing surrealism. And that was, but at the same time, we're very Anglo-centric and we revert to our language. And those are the choices, I guess.
And speaking for myself, in some of my limited history of publishing poetry that's written outside this country, it's a really hard job getting people to buy the books. I mean, it's there's a real barrier there.
I agree.
The press that I ran, many press.
Yeah.
I did publish a poet called Amarjit Chandan, Punjabi poet, and I think it's the only many press book that was reprinted. In fact, I think it was reprinted twice. I was on the committee of something called the South Asian Literature Society, which was set up in the late 70s by Ranjana Ash, which was intended to bring Asian literature to a wide audience. In fact, the people who came were almost all members of the Asian community. We had a lot of events, and I mean, this was not experimental poetry, but there were major writers often passing through London. So it was rather in a sealed compartment. And I guess the people who bought Amarjit's book, very many of them were, again, members of the Asian community who were glad to see somebody published. But then, of course, Stephen, was very involved with poets writing in other languages and bringing them together in an anthology.
Yeah, and there certainly is a lot more activity now. Whether more books are being sold, moot point, but there is certainly more activity in terms of international poets, not just Anglo-centric, coming here to read, and the exchange between. We now have things like the Poetry Translation Centre, that online resource, which has made a big difference. And people like Blood Axe, Carcanet, there's a certain amount of internationalism in their lists. Whether it's been read more, who knows? Who knows? But just turning to that question of legacy, what do you think the legacy is? What from that period?
Yeah, some of it was what happened in the 80s.
Right.
I mean, there was the linguistically innovative poetics of the 80s. Not necessarily as a direct inheritance, but at least in dialogue with that inheritance.
Yeah.
And then I think also some of the things happening in London now are part, I think of as part of that legacy, but maybe
such as?
See that way. I'm just thinking there's a lot of things going on in London these days, a lot of different readings, which for me seem to be part of that same tradition. So I'm thinking about series like Crossing the Line, which would seem to me to have its roots in what was going on in the 70s, but that might be wrong.
Ken?
Who knows? I don't know.
What do you reckon?
I don't know. It's I don't. What I'd be interested to know is for people who've come to the innovative poetry writing scene in London or elsewhere today. I don't know what the extent of the knowledge is about what happened before. I'd be interested to know that. You know what has entered history. Yeah.
Maybe it's too soon to say. Could well be. But I certainly, when you look at the pages of this book and see, and I come back to this, the energy. There was so much going on, and I absolutely don't get that sense today. I mean, there are pockets of activity, but nothing like the sweep here. So that was of its particular time, and that in some way has gone. And maybe there is something in technology and the internet, and there's a lot going on there that we don't actually need anymore to be in the room above the pub, that this stuff can be shared and communicated online. Maybe that is making a big difference. But equally, I don't get the same sense of experimentalism in poetry.
Well, I think one of the things, I'm going to be a bit controversial here, but the move into the academy is quite an important factor, I think, and in particular, for instance, the burgeoning of creative writing degrees and all that. And I'm terribly ambivalent about that, I have to say. It seems to me that a lot of the writing has been standardized now. It's become a genre like any other genres, and there may be, as a result, there isn't the sense of making new connections. But I might be quite wrong, because I'm probably quite out of touch with a lot of what's happening now.
But I have to. Yes,
there is.
Turn to you.
Yes.
There's a very disturbing book which you may have encountered, The Glass Cage by Nicholas Carr, which is about how computer technology is altering the structure of the human brain, and not just the synapses, but the way that the brain is actually built. And what is lacking now is a personal contact. Charles Lawton once said to me after one of his readings, "I am at my best," he said, "if I can look into your eyes and you can look into my eyes." And that is not what is on the internet.
I mean, on a happier note, we've given readings in Manchester and Edinburgh in recent years, and there's been really large audiences of young people, and very enthusiastic, and that's definitely to do with performance as much as anything, the same as you get at Crossing the Line. So there is this appetite and enthusiasm for experimental performance poetry. Certainly at the moment.
No, I just want to take you back to the academy. Because I know you want to say something about that.
Well, I can understand Ken's ambivalence about creative writing programs producing a product, but I think it's also been quite useful, that move into the academy, particularly in terms of presence of women involved in experimental writing. And it's partly because the academy is a safer space than the rooms over pubs used to be, I guess, among other things.
It's an interesting point,
But it is dangerous. I mean,
it is, and you sometimes go to a reading in a city and you don't get anybody from the academy, or you go to a reading in the academy and you won't get anybody from the city. There's that kind of town gown separation as well, which is dangerous.
And of course, it is famously difficult still to generate poetry audiences, except for the mainstream, well-known. It is an ongoing conundrum for event
possibly
organisers.
something that's seen as performance, as go along to the LFC.
And we have seen the advent of the poetry slam and all of that. So
there is all that,
Which must be a legacy. the performance poetry.
But yes, it's bifurcated, isn't it? I mean, what used to be at the time of the Children of Albion anthology used to be one huge, diverse world of different kinds of weird and new poetries coming together, has fragmented somewhat into different scenes, like, that's avant-garde poetry, that's slam poetry, that's feminist poetry, and so there is no longer one thing called poetry. There are pockets there are scenes that don't kind of have anything to do with each other.
Yeah.
Although sometimes, as you said, sometimes it comes together when an audience is brought up against somebody that they haven't encountered before. So
some of the success of some of these events is down to actually straightforward competence on the part of the people running it. And I remember going to the CCCP events in Cambridge in the last decade. And it got to the stage where there was nobody there in the audience except the other people who were reading.
Yeah.
And that was because the organisers, whose names I shall leave out of this discussion, failed to put any posters up anywhere in Cambridge, which is quite a big town, has a lot of people interested in poetry. And that's a very simple example of how incompetent it can be.
Yeah.
And I've seen that replicated in many other places.
Yeah.
But I've also been to organisations which were very, very competent.
Good art.
The Aldeburgh Poetry Festival.
Absolutely.
I don't particularly like most of what they put on there.
Yeah.
But it was astonishing. It was they sold out a theatre 400 seats for a reading that included Roy Fisher. I think he was quite happy. It was a superb event, magnificently run, and if only that sort of professionalism was applied elsewhere, I think things would improve.
And efforts have been made, Tony, to do that, to get that professionalism into the sector. Not always with success, but there are pockets of excellence, I think, around the country.
There's also, I think, the other point is the sense of community gets lost. As you go into the academy, it's a different kind of community.
Yeah.
It's a kind of self-selective community that's happening with those other events, CCTV, I suppose is one, but
sure.
Crossing the line, there's a group of people who come along all the time, and it can feel a little bit exclusionary to newcomers. There's a provincial organisation I won't mention, where I actually had to take the organisers aside and said, "Do you realise that nobody who's a newcomer will ever come again?" And they said, "Why?" They were very friendly, but it didn't feel that way.
Right.
They were, because it was a system of 10 people cracking in jokes with each other. Had I not known those people, I would have felt excluded.
Yeah.
This is so well known in the music world as well. Terry Edwards, who used to tour magical groups around, went to one seaside place where they had been booked, and with a group of about half a dozen who were going to sing, Gesualdo and Monteverdi, and the person who was organized it met him and said, "I'm afraid that we haven't had much luck on ticket sales. We'll do what we can." They showed up at the place. There was nobody there except the caretaker. Even the organizer hadn't come. And they thought, well, if we're going to get paid for this, we better do something. Yeah. So Terry got up, walked to the front of the stage, and addressed the empty hall. Before we begin, he said, "We should tell you that the music you're about to hear was meant to be sung by a group of friends around a table. Not for a paying audience such as yourself."
Tell them about the band.
Yeah, so Ken, I was just thinking about, I guess I've never really felt connected to any scene, but I've sort of seen some mainstream stuff and some experimental stuff, and I'm always on the lookout for something that's properly shows innovation. So I feel you when the shit events, and the most inspiring ones that I've witnessed has been with Stephen Fowler, and his Enemies series. So I had something in 3AM magazine, and he invited me to one, and hooked me up with a poet, and we became mates. And it was like 100 of us, pairs in the Rich Mix in Shoreditch, and it was totally packed. And not only that, see, it's not just Brick Lane, but I'm going to another one of his projects in Berlin on Monday night. He's done it in Mexico, Iceland, Hungary. Yeah. And I think it's also that, because we don't really just want a sort of a flat screen of digital, everyone together sort of stuff. There has to be a physical, performative connection, I think. And by saying, let's do something called Enemies, we don't, because not really speaking on behalf of anybody, but if you're old enough to be aware of poetry wars, mainstream experimental arguments and all that, we can sort of, in a sense, have more fun with them these days by the idea of a collaboration. They might not work, but they might work, and when you get this amount of people, poets together working in different medias, visual or digital or sound, poetry, improvisation, it's a lot more interesting. There's no clubs, cliques, factions, and no boredom. So just sort of add to try and sort of say that there is some decent stuff out there. That's the most decent stuff I've come across so far, anyway. Because obviously, the thing with this subject that what you guys are talking about is it's the energy. That's what we sort of want, isn't it? Yeah. So we feed off. Yeah. So,
well, Stephen is extraordinarily energetic, I have to say.
I'll ask him when I see him. One thing is, maybe there's a couple of, or maybe he doesn't sleep or something. I don't really know how it is. I don't really know how it is in the emails, but maybe, I don't know.
But again, that's back to the individual, isn't it? There you have the Eric Martin, you have Steve. There's people who are really driving stuff forward. That makes such a difference.
Yeah, I've been involved in an Enemies event. I was in Wales, and it's wonderful. And some of my favourite poets were involved in it, as well as a lot of performance, multimedia. Occasionally I kind of miss the old dour sort of subvoicive intensity where you'd have like two people listening to you read for an hour or something and taking it terribly seriously. Sometimes it's good to have a full length where people really do analyse what you're doing and you think about it really hard.
It's just interesting these pages to read. Drifts through the John Lennon and Yoko Ono, kind of before they were John Lennon and Yoko Ono, and it was a terrific time. Just looking at somebody who wasn't there. And I have to quote the Lawrence Upton's wonderful first visit to the Poetry Society. As I walked in on my first visit to the Poetry Society, a woman handed me a glass of white wine asking, "Are you a bard?" I bring those days back. It's got to be.
But that presumably is the old Poetry Society.
That's the old,
which had the first reading prize, was its big event of the year.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the James Thurber cartoon.
Any other questions, reflections, anecdotes? Before I send us all next door for a glass of white wine. Bards only. No, good. Well, look, I think it's been terrifically interesting. The book is on sale, and do have a look at it. There's some wonderful stuff in it, and it's been a real privilege for me, who wasn't part of that scene, to be part of a conversation like this tonight. But particular thanks to Ken and to Robert. Thank you both.
Thank you guys.